Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aditi Shendray. I'm a research scientist at the Ohio State University, working with Dr. Sarah Quinney and Langley within the MPrint DMKRCC core. Our research is focused on developing the MPrint knowledge base and portal. Um, so the goal of the knowledge base and portal is to kind of um, get all the data and resources that are related to the maternal and pediatric therapeutics together in one place. And this will include pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic, pharmacogenetic data, as well as pediatric ontogeny and other physiological changes that occur during pregnancy and lactation. So to just give a brief outline of what we'll be talking about today. So I'll go over the ontology and then some of the subcategories and components that we are considering for the knowledge base. Then walk through one of the examples for a PubMed search and review strategy that we considered for curation, looking at the data curation tool itself, the portal after that, and then planning the next steps. And of course, I think at the end, we are hoping to get input from all the potential users of the knowledge base, what you would like to see in the knowledge base and the portal. So starting with the ontology, and all those who have been here since yesterday might have seen this slide. So the idea is to start with the populations themselves. So on one side, there's the maternal population, and the other, the pediatric. Then focusing on the subpopulations themselves. So there's the pregnancy group and then the postpartum group. So looking at both physiological, non-physiological changes, and then lactation itself. And then from after looking at the populations themselves, moving on to the studies and sub-studies. So we're considering pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic studies, the clinical trials, pharmacoepidemiological studies, and other omics studies as well. And then they themselves have their own sub branches. And so the idea is really to try and capture as much as data as possible. And I know it's a very complicated process, but we're trying to include all components as possible. So, the population characteristics of the study, the disease elements, the specimens that were used in the pharmacokinetic studies. We are also looking at in silico studies like the PV-PK models and the population PK models that can inform drug development and dosing in pediatric populations. And then moving down, when we look at pregnancy stages, of course, there are the 3 different stages that are considered. I know that, usually it's looked at as a continuum, looking at gestational age or gestational period, but then try and capture as much information as is available in the literature. And then the data elements themselves specific to each of the studies. So there's the ontology is similar in the pediatric population. Of course, the subpopulations are different, and so we'll try to classify them based on what the study is focusing on. So if it is a fetus, preterm neonate, infants, and older children, then moving on to the categories themselves that we considered. So I mentioned the different populations. When it comes to the maternal population, we have the different pregnancy stages and then the postpartum stage. Then there's the adult population, which is used as a reference in quite a few studies. If you look at pharmacokinetic studies, there you can see that comparison group might be adult women who are not pregnant. So we have that as well. Then on the pediatric side, there's the maternal fetal, the complex, and then other pediatric populations. And I've included a host of subpopulations here, but I guess it depends on what the interests are. And so we based on the interest, we'll go there. Looking at the different sub-studies, we want to include pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic data, pharmacoepidemiology as well, clinical trials, pharmacometrics, the different models that are involved, and other omics data, which is looking at effect of genetics on the other PKPD parameters or any of the clinical endpoints. Uh, Capturing specimen information. This is relevant in PK studies. So what kind of a specimen was used? Those related to the blood, like plasma, serum, DNA, different tissues, urine specimens. Then there are other swaths of specimens that are used when it comes to pregnancy, specifically the amniotic fluid, cervical vaginal fluid, and the placenta. Breast milk in the postpartum population, and then cord blood or hemostatic meconium in the fetal population. Some of the uncommon sources that were informed to us about were DNA from the milk or other biopsies or autopsy tissue. And one of the components that is important in PK studies is time to specimen to get those concentration values. So we're trying to capture that as well. Disease and conditions themselves, these are, I guess, relevant when it comes to pharmacodynamic or pharmacoepidemiology studies. And so any of the pre-existing conditions in the mother, especially those that affect drug response and drug levels in the blood, like renal or hepatic impairment, other comorbidities that are commonly seen, like hypertension or diabetes, pregnancy-specific ones that come into mind are preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and postpartum, there's postpartum hemorrhage or depression, and then the pediatric focus, like congenital disorders and neonatal outcomes. Of course, I'm just mentioning a handful of these. There are a whole lot of them, and we'll have to figure out which ones are of interest. Then, of course, with omics, I only have like the subclassifications and not really a lot of details, because we are really hoping to get more information from the subject matter experts to really tell us what they would like to see in the knowledge base. So some of the common study-based data elements when it comes to PKPD, there are those related to bioavailability, concentrations, the clearance outcomes, and then the volume of distribution. When it comes to clinical trials, there's the efficacy and safety related outcomes that are usually investigated, and then the surrogates are different biomarkers themselves. When it comes to pharmacoepidemiology, the neonatal outcomes, and sometimes just survival overall or progression from survival is taken into account. So just some brief ones. And then when it comes to population specific, some PK related ones are fetal maternal ratios or the milk to plasma ratio, and the estimation of either absolute or relative infant dose with clinical or pharmacoepi ones. A lot of them are related to growth or when baby was born. So it's preterm, prematurity, growth restriction, small for gestational age, Apgar scores. When it comes to opioids, neonatal abstinence syndrome is investigated quite frequently. Neonatal mortality and other developmental delays. Just to briefly mention some of the data sources, we just started with PubMed articles. So using the NLM PubMed database and using the existing literature to start our curation process. But then the hope is that we can move on to other databases, or at least try and link to them, or maps, especially when it comes to existing ontologies or databases, trying to map to those. So to briefly talk about the PubMed search itself and the review strategy that we currently used. Um, so the search terms that we applied were the population focus, so either pregnancy or pediatric population, then it was study focused. At this point, we are looking at pharmacokinetics and pharmacoepidemiology, and then drug classes or drug names themselves. We started with, we started with pregnancy, pharmacokinetic opioids, something small and what we considered as a relatively easy way to curate some data, and then opioids because one of the centers of excellence are focusing on that group of drug class. So we started with those. And so as of June 12th, there were about 391 articles in PubMed. And then when we apply filters like the human filter and the review filter, we excluded about 1974 articles. And so it left about 227 for manual review. And of course, the numbers keep changing as you move on. So earlier ones had a fewer articles when we tried to review them. And so ultimately, after the manual review process, we had 108 articles for the PK studies for data curation itself. So our initial criteria was to kind of focus on just the clinical or the human studies, not include any reviews. I know reviews are useful to kind of get to articles that are not easily accessible or have been missed, and that is something we haven't consider, are considering and have in mind. But it's for now we were trying to get to individual articles that we could actually curate. Then not looking at any kind of medication frequency or patterns of use studies. They are pretty common when it comes to pharmacotherapy studies, but I guess they also tend to focus on very local or specific populations. So for now, we kind of excluded them. And no studies where the drug of interest was only just one of many risk factors, or a secondary drug, not really the primary drug of interest. So on and so forth. We just, when we curated or reviewed the articles, we included single drug PK studies, drug interaction PK studies, other case reports that are there. And then when it comes to pharmacotherapy, any kind of prospective or retrospective studies that focus on the drug itself. We plan to demo the curation tool and the portal itself, but I was hoping to just go through the slides before we get to it and I move on to the browser. So just to kind of give an overview of the infrastructure, so Lei Wang has been our creator. He made the development, the curation tool and the portal, both of them. And we're using RShiny, the platform, to host these. And then the data itself is stored in a MySQL database, and we're using the Microsoft Azure platform for that. And when it comes to other files, like the figures or supplemental files, we're planning to store them currently in Google Drive. And then after demonstrating the tool itself, I'll talk about the portal and go over the portal. But just to give a brief description of what the design is. So we went with a dashboard format for now, and we're making it drug-centric. So being able to search by a particular drug or a drug class. We have a left-hand sidebar, which kind of gives search, filter, or download options. And we'll see what are the different options there. And then for now, we have different tabs. We have a summary tab, which kind of gives a summary of the distribution, the study distribution, and the population distribution for a particular drug. And in the study tab itself, we have the PMIDs, the drug name, the title, and the population type. Then we have a PK parameters tab, which actually shows the different PK parameters that have been curated so far for a pharmacokinetic study. And then when it comes to pharmacotherapy, we have a risk factors tab that are associated with the outcomes, and an outcomes tab itself, which shows the relationship between the exposure of interest and the outcome. And I guess the next steps, which would be part of, I guess, the user input and feedback discussion as well. But the hope is that we kind of go through a consensus building exercise, talk to all the subject matter experts to get an idea of, I'm sorry, to get an idea of what kind of knowledge and data they're hoping to see in the knowledge base, prioritizing what kind of population studies and drugs they want to see, and then talking about the portal design itself. And of course, there are issues with the knowledge base, looking at quality control and then harmonization. And in the end, just we're hoping to hire folks. We're looking at hiring 2 data curators at this point, and then at some point in the future to hire web developers. Okay. And just briefly to talk about the acknowledgements. So this is supported by the NICHD Imprint Hub and the DMKRCCs, where Langley and Sarah Quinney are the PIs, and the development of the curation tool and the portal itself was done by Lee Wong, who is also a research scientist at the Ohio State University. And both the knowledge-based design and curation, the contributions involved were from Langley, Sarah Quinney herself, Lee Wong, and then some of the IU folks like Blessed Winston, Yassine Abbasi, and Norgesh Kamsani. So I will, at this point, move on to the tool. Let me just stop sharing this, and I'm going to show the tool itself.
Great. Thank you, Aditi. It seems Lang's having computer issues and his internet is down. So hopefully he'll be able to call in and join us shortly, but we can go ahead and take feedback and questions so that, Aditi and Lay can help answer and I can provide support when possible.
So let me just go over the tool briefly, and then we can also look at the portal, and then I guess after that we can open it up for discussion.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay. So can you see my browser? Sarah, can you see the tool itself?
Yes, we see the login screen.
Oh, okay. So since this was done internally, we decided to have kind of a login page as well, in addition to kind of keep track of who was doing the curation, and if you had to go back and really review the data, that kind of a thing. So we started a log on, and then this was PK focused. And so we had different tabs for different components of the study. So we start with the study information itself, where we capture what the PMID is, and then any associated IDs as well. Not all of them are required per se, but since not all articles tend to have ID, maybe PMID, so there were options to include other IDs as well. We, of course, made the population and the study type a requirement to capture the components that we are focusing on. So when it came to population, we had options for maternal pregnancy, postpartum lactation, and then the other pediatric related subpopulations as well. And there's an option to choose more than one. So we can choose maternal, pediatric, and say preterm or neonatal, something like that. And then when it came to the study type, there were options to add more than one, because sometimes a clinical trial might present pharmacokinetic related parameters, so an option to choose more than one. Um, we included a species tab for future if we include in vitro studies, but for now it's just focused on the human studies. Each of this, so the process we went through was to have a save option for each of these sub tabs so that it would have save the information in a temporary database, and then the ultimate would be to submit the whole save curation to the MySQL database. And so we, after this, uh, so we also try to capture population information. So if there's age, weight, other characteristics for the mother or the child, then we try to capture those. The drug information itself, especially the drug dosage in pharmacokinetic studies. Um, the idea was to capture the actual value of the dose, specify the units, and so we have drop down options for those to kind of include what the units were, and then the summary statistics themselves. So if it was so we were trying to focus on aggregate data initially, so either a mean standard deviation or a median with the interquartile range. But when it comes to pharmacoepi studies, of course, there are other statistics like the absolute and the relative risks. Um, with each tab, we also tried to kind of capture the population itself. So if it was related to the mother or any of the pediatric population, and then the pregnancy stage, if it was within a specific pregnancy stage, or if the gestational age information in weeks or days was available, then that was captured separately. We also had an option for notes in each tab to kind of capture any relevant information related to that particular parameter. Specimen information as well, so different types of specimens that were used um, uh, in the study. Then the value would depend on, so value might include just the number of specimens that were captured, because sometimes it's more than one for a particular patient. So um, and then the time itself, which is pretty relevant in a pharmacokinetic study. So that was the specimen information tab. For the PK parameters itself, we went back and forth over what we really want to capture. So some general information as to whether metabolites were measured and whether we can see any individual level data, because a lot of PK studies have some small sample sizes, so they tend to present the patient level data itself. At this point, it was really difficult to try and get all of it in, and we're not sure if that is something that the users would want to see in the database itself. So for now, we kind of try to capture the information if it was there in the manuscripts or supplemental files, or if we could get that by requesting it from the author, or if it is not available, and then any kind of concentration time data, because that tends to be in the figures itself. So then that would indicate that if it was an open access article, we could go and probably try and capture the figures themselves. Then the PK parameters themselves, we have the drug name, the analyte name, the specimen that is related to population, pregnancy stage, and then go on to kind of include what the parameter type was. We for most of the drop-down options, in addition to the drop-down option itself, we had a ability to kind of manually enter text. So if something was not available, we could just enter that information and collect the values for that. We also had a tab for model information, because with PK, there are PKP or population-based PK studies. And so it is, however, difficult to kind of capture all the parameters that are related to the model. And so as a temporary measure for now, we kind of included a few options where we looked at the model structure, whether parameters were available and whether code is available. So I guess uh, when it comes to discussion, the question is about, do we really collect metadata or do we collect, actual data that is there in the articles? And then the outcomes were more PD outcomes that are related to or are sometimes presented in the PK studies. So that's why we have an outcomes option. So that's the tool we had for PK specifically. Um, for PE, we kind of just chose to go with an Excel sheet for now, but the question is whether we can include the different kinds of studies within one app, or would it require development of different apps? Um, so I'll move on to the portal itself. Um, so as I mentioned early on, it's more like a dashboard format. We have like the header itself, with options for browsing the data, then the data catalog, and then just talking about imprint briefly, but maybe hoping to include other external links here. So when it comes to browsing the data, we have a search tab for the drugs. And so we can start, for now we have opioids and the opioids drug class here. So we can start with the drug and then search for those. The summary tab changes based on the drug, and it kind of gives them distribution for the different pharmacokinetic and pharmacotherapy studies and the populations within those studies. And we see different kinds here because there's overlap. And so we try to capture those multiple different classifications here. And then from here, there are filter options where you can see the population and then the study type. We have the maternal options by the maternal population and pediatric, and then the different studies. So I can just choose one for now. The studies within a maternal population would be combined, but we are hoping to separate them out so that when we click on lactation, we only capture the breast milk related studies. So moving on to the study page, then this kind of shows the initial information for the studies, so PMIDs, what the title of the study itself is, what the primary drug is within the study, the population, and then the study type. We are also linking the studies themselves to PubMed. So if I click on this, I will go to PubMed, so that if anyone wants additional information on the article and can access a PDF, they can get it. When it comes to the PK parameters, for now, based on the tool that we saw, we have the portal structured similarly. But of course, it's up for discussion to how we want to see it. But for each of them, we have like an option to search for a specific. So if I want a specific population, I can search for that. If I want just the breast milk, I can search for it and get breast milk here. And then if I just wanted Cmax, I can search for it and then get the Cmax values. So if there's specific interest, then folks can just search for those and get that information. When it comes to the pharmacoepi studies, like I said, the association of risk factors themselves with the outcomes. So one of the studies that focused on preterm deliveries and versus term deliveries, if any of the demographic characteristics or other characteristics were associated with the outcomes themselves. And when it comes to the outcomes in the pharmacoepi studies and what kind of exposure they were associated with, and then the summary statistics themselves, like I mentioned, either the absolute risk or the odds ratio themselves. And I can choose to see one specific one. And there's also an option to select the variables themselves here. So I can choose to only look at very few of these. if I wanted, and or um, the option to kind of inverse. So if you wanted to exclude any of the variables, you could do so as well. You can apply those selections. And then we have the option to download the data, either as an Excel, CSV, or a tab file. This and we created data catalog. It's more like a data dictionary for now, where we're kind of describing what each of the variable themselves is, to kind of explain what the person is looking at. So that is what we have so far.
Right, great. Thanks, Aditi. See, Lang has joined us again. So we can address some of the questions in the chat that you may not be able to see yet, Lang.
Yeah,
So
the database technically is alive, as a matter of fact. And however, the number of drugs in the database is not, too many yet. We're talking about right now is only focusing on opioids, which we have sizable data. But we're really hoping the next year or so get more data on the drug data information into the database. And I think right now, what I worry though is the interface has too much information. So I think one thing we really want to get feedback from community though is how much information you really wanted to see, and then what would be information you don't want to see so much to begin with, right? Another question from Rachel is who will be the main audience of the resource? I think it's going to be quite comprehensive. We obviously see physicians, they want to see it, obviously. Then, people doing, clinical pharmacology, they want to see the data, PK data as well. I think those are, the primary two audience, and also people doing epidemiology studies, they also want to see it. That's our kind of expectation. And a question from Ryan is, how do you validate specific drug names? Right now, we just take the drug name from the publication first, and all the drug names normalized by drug bank ID. So that's where the underlying database look like. Wow, the question is overwhelming. Yes, so people asking for the linkage of the database. Aditi, you may want to send out on the lay as well. If you may want to send out linkage to everyone, then people can start to look into that. So there's also a question from Kevin Watt. Will the data collect focus on the public literature or the raw data? The answer is that we focus on published paper first. Okay, we're not collecting raw data, and all the raw data will technically go to the dash, not the imprinted database. And from Upusa Pooling say, I don't know if there's results line needs to be extracted by the data on the methodology is great, so some new study can be consistent with prior. That question is loaded. I don't have an answer on that. I think I will let people raise a hand as well if you wanted to speak up. I'll be happy to answer questions. There are questions, Sarah from Edmond Caparelli saying, are we collecting formulation dosing data? I think the dose data is there. Formulation, that's a really good question. Aditi, do we collect formulation data?
We haven't collected that as yet.
Okay. put it down as,
Mhm.
yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I think there's ability in some places to put it in, but I will note that it's rarely explained what the formulation is.
Right.
So that's hard to capture, which Edmund knows as well. So
All right, so the question talking about capture specific drug administration detail. I do believe we can capture dosing regimen information in the data collection, especially for PK studies. So we have that timing on top of that, we have that in the database. But having said that, whether those information will be visualized in the portal, we're still debating ourselves what's the best way to show the data. But technically, if you want to download the data from database, you should have all the information we collected, including those information. I saw Aaron raise his hand. Aaron, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I've got a huge number of questions. I'll go through a couple. Yeah, so one question relates to prioritization of adding new drugs, and especially, and I can put the request for information, but we're also currently going through the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act drug prioritization process right now.
Okay.
Have you given any thoughts to how you would prioritize drugs? I'm going to use pediatrics as the lead example right now.
I think this is perfect timing we're talking about is, we right now do not have a prioritization list yet. I think that's where one of the goal of this meeting is seek feedback from NIH, from FDA, and from imprint community of which drugs you want us to do first. The opioids is largely because as part of our Vanderbilt collaboration over there. It's and we had some modeling thing going on from our side. So this is kind of a starting point where it's trying to establish feasibility. But having said that, we really need a list first. Yeah. Aaron,
yeah, so I can definitely, I can find the latest list for the BPCA, the last priority list. I think that would be a good starting point. And one thing, I don't know if Dr. Perdita Taylor-Zapata, who oversees the BPCA clinical program, is on the call or not, but definitely I think we should make sure there are discussions as the next prioritization process goes forward, and how that can line up with the imprint, with what you're doing with the knowledge base. And after that, we can also really think about that in terms of prioritization for PregLac. That's another activity that's going to be coming down the road. There are recommendations there, and certainly, everybody on this audience, I want to encourage you to take a look at the request for information that I posted in the chat, which is seeking input. So that would also be a great way. The Imprint Hub is funded through the BPCA to let us know what you think needs to be prioritized, and we can make sure that gets incorporated, as well as reaching out to the Imprint Hub directly. What the other question, a more open-ended question. So one thing, and got to limit this just thinking about pharmacokinetics right now, just because pharmacodynamics is even more complicated. But what do you think about how this knowledge base would start to interface with our understanding of physiology, and obviously thinking about how that interfaces and grows to physiological based pharmacokinetic modeling down the road? And that might be a little bit of a, I think, question for both you and Sarah.
Let me go there a little bit first. So we actually had a touch base on this question yesterday. One thing Sarah and I been talking back and forth is all about how do we standardize the model in general, right? To disseminate them to the general research community. So in terms of modeling, there's three type major model. One is non-quantum model, which doesn't rely on anything, mathematical formula, right? So that information is captured already. Then the pub PK model, it's probably the next easy thing we can do. But having said that, The real challenge over there though is we don't see the diversity of public PK model yet. So we don't have adequate data to really formulate that, right? The third thing, obviously, PPK model. Even a PPK model, they're fully grown PPK model. Then there's also semi PPK model as well. And then the challenge over there is not only the data, but also the model formula as well. So right now, the current strategies really say, okay, in database, we can capture the paper where we can in the database say there's model publishing that paper, and there's some description of model, not necessarily in the fields, predefined fields, more like text to describe it. Then people can go to the paper and trying to figure out what the model is. That's what we're trying to capture right now. But I think, Sarah, maybe you and Rob are gonna continue developing kind of a model, kind of a knowledge-based, kind of a formulation a little bit more than we can go from there. So I will let you speak on the model side.
So I'll agree. When you're talking about pop PK and PBPK models, there's so much variability in the structure that it's difficult to capture everything that someone would need to know from the study in a database like this. So we're really focused right now on identifying the papers and providing some general information about the drug, the population, the dose route, type of information that's available, whether the what program was used, and kind of the model structure, whether data is available. So some of those more metadata type aspects of it, which would then allow individual users to go and identify papers that are relevant to whatever drug and population they're looking in. But honestly, as a pharmacologist, you really need to read the paper to get the information you're looking for out from those details, and trying to put it into a database format would just be somewhat overwhelming, I think, with the variability in it. Even when you're comparing like a 1 compartment and a 2 compartment PK models for a pop PK, the number of covariates that could be added or data terms on your model will differ. So I think that the easiest way is for us to give the metadata, a link to the paper, and then allow the user to pull out the other information that they need. I know there was some discussion earlier in the chat about the fact that just the study design information is important, and so that I think is going to be the type of information you can pull out: what the population is, what the dose is, what analytes were measured and modeled. So you'll find that, and then you can go back and search in more detail for those papers that you're more interested in. So.
I guess just one follow-up to that, and this is, I know, very definitely future thinking. Certainly we have this very pharmacological focused database, and and the other way to bring in, I'll say, physiological information and maybe pharmacogenomic information is a little bit easier in some ways, because PharmGKB is a more closer relational database. Have you given any thoughts to sort of that data level connection? And what I'm thinking of, if one were to query drugs, would you get to, could there be a way to link to or pull in some summary information on pharmacogenomics? And even thinking further on that, there is there are human expression databases, tissue expression databases, which obviously contain at least expression level for drug metabolizing and transport enzymes. And there is developmental GTEx, which is just up and running, will eventually be a resource on that for pediatrics. Have you thought about how those type of relations can go? And maybe pharmacogenomics is the one that's a little bit easier to get our hands on first.
Absolutely, Aaron. I think this is where, when you look at the data collection process we designed for either clinical study or from the EPI study, and they are, we call it risk factors for drug effects, right? And when you look at literature, some of the risk factors are genetically related. So that's exactly pharmacogenetics is all about, right? But there are more than that. There are other risk factors, either some of the protein based, some of the metabolite based, some of the more other testing based, and we're going to collect all those data. That's where we call it risk factor. It's going to overlap with from GKB's data quite a bit. And I think that's where we're gonna work with from GKB trying to accomplish on that. And I think right now that when we're collecting data, I think we integrate all of them together as potential risk factors. And that's how we annotate the data right now. And we'll see how much genetic data and I would say biomarker data we can collect from literature, and we may want to segregate it a bit more down the road. But right now we see a lot of clinical disease risk factors, demographic risk factors, but we haven't seen enough biomarkers yet. So that's where we're going to see how that thing's going to go along the way. And having said that, I think one of the major challenge of data creation for the clinical data is the clinical studies is all about the names of disease, the name of those clinical variables published in the literature. They're extremely diverse. So we, at the end of the day, I think somehow we needed to work with from GKB, make sure we're in the same kind of a plan in terms of how do we annotate those clinical informations, especially clinical variables. I would say we're not there yet. We're just trying to see what's diversity and how do we accommodate that.
So I wanted to comment a bit on follow on Sarah's comment about the heterogeneity sometimes in types of models that are applied. But Aaron, I think you raised a really important point. Could we go by drug and actually look? I mean, is it an advantage to pull this together? Say, well, what is the heterogeneity in the way this drug is being described? What is the heterogeneity in the reporting of, let's say, tissue partition? I mean, these are future things, but they could be some things you could zero in on. And if you could get to that level of detail, it's maybe putting that at sort of the second or third level of evaluating this and being able to collate it. And I know at least in the mid 1990s, there were several conferences on PBPK at Georgetown where we talked about. Yes, there's a lot of variability, but it's really good to know where they came from and the type of experiments that you could try to interpret how you might want to move forward on something. This was strictly, of course, speaking from adult drug development. That was the FDA and the CDDS program, but being able to at least get a sense of that at a population level, where on what elements of a model are variability being identified. What covariates are showing up? How many different ones? How likely are they to be correlated? But this is sort of that second, maybe in third level. This is the future, future steps. But maybe this also helps to feed to allow us to go from the data to knowledge, and maybe knowledge part way to wisdom, and looking at those kinds of those interrelations directly. It'll be interesting to note as well, just in terms of that heterogeneity, just one more aside, there's actually a poster, there's going to be a presentation at the PAGE meeting. There's a lot of interest in sort of automated approaches, and just strictly numerical approaches, depending on which direction you start from, result in very different solutions. So I think always remembering that clinical pharmacology and anatomy and pathophysiology is really critical to bring to the table. Sort of automatic ways of numerically capturing patterns if you're trying to make an inference are. I mean, it's they're generally overdetermined even in relatively simple model systems.
I'm still sifting through the questions. There's so many good ones. I wanted to respond to Sarah V from Vanderbilt asking about whether we can capture the outcome definition from the paper. As a matter of fact, we should. I think that's a really great question. As a matter of yesterday, when I listened to the talks yesterday, I think that's the one thing we definitely gonna do. Because as a matter of fact, when people using EHR data to define outcomes, they actually put those outcome definition in the methodology section. For example, how phenotype be defined was different IC9 code or lab tests or other variables. Many paper has that information. I think this is going to be valuable information we can collect and put in the database, Knowledgebase. So we definitely can do it. Right now, we don't have that. As a matter of fact, we have very general description, but we're not there yet. But that definitely something Aditi and I we can expand on that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we've come across with building these databases, the variability in the data, even for simple things of how the data is reported and what's done.
Exactly.
So studies where they collect data at delivery and give cord and maternal ratios, they don't always give the timing of the drug collection with respect to dosing, or some papers will give an average dose administered but not an individual dose, and then maybe not list any of the the not dose normalize their concentration. So there's a lot of issues in how the data has been reported over the years. Obviously newer studies tend to do a lot better, but I think even with you're looking PK, we see variability, and I'm sure in the PD and the more pharmacoepidemiology research, it's going to be even worse, especially as some definitions change over time. So that's going to be really important to capture. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Rachel, I'm assuming Rachel's from GKB. So I do want to ask a couple of questions for Farm GKB folks as well. One challenge we can foresee is let's say we did a query on opioids, say in the middle of May, and we recorded all the query information, collect all the data, right? So, but then we move on to study the other drugs afterwards. And obviously, maybe in a couple more years, then there's more data being published on the opioids. And I just wondering from GKP standpoint, how do you arrange your data curation process where you can constantly come back to the drugs you did kind of a data curation already, and constantly come back and collect information. Do you have being kind of a regular protocol or process being set up to help you to do that?
Yeah, so the PharmGKB curation system is set up more on as literature gets caught by our curators. And so as a curator finds literature that has to do with a particular drug or whatever, even if it's after we've done curation on that, our annotation pipeline concentrates on having these atomic annotations that can be created or updated over time.
Okay.
So I think it's sort of a different starting point for PharmGKB than it is what it sounds like for the mPrint system. Since mPrint sounds like it's more drug focused, PharmGKB tends to be more literature focused. So it's an accumulation of literature for different drugs over time. And then on the PharmGKB website and the front end that the public sees, we make nice sort of summaries for them to see all this data that we've collected over time. And you'll see the annotation dates sort of update as more annotation gets added. Does that answer your question?
Not totally. Let me try and rephrase my question a little bit.
Sure.
I think PharmGKB and us mPrint right now is very similar in a way. We really focus on the PubMed literature, as a matter of fact. My question is that would PharmacyGate track those papers being reviewed already in the past? Then you don't have to do it again. Every time the new paper not being reviewed at PharmacyGate will be tagged and highlighted for curators to do it. Do you have a system like that?
Yeah, so our curation process right now is, we have curators that monitor particular journals and things for articles. I mean, Rachel would be able to speak better to this, but we have a known set of a few dozen journals that we monitor on a regular basis that get annotated. And then we also are working on, we have some NLP pipelines that are feeding into for known sort of terms based off of papers that we've already curated that are feeding into these models that are suggesting to us new literature to look at too. And that's an ongoing activity right now, which I think I remember from the presentation yesterday, this is something that Emprint's interested in sort of developing too, is to get some sort of NLP AI pipeline going for your literature suggestion. So yeah.
That will be something we'll be glad to work with you guys.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting process.
We're at a different stage. I think you guys curate a lot already. I think focusing on the new literature will be definitely the top priority for you guys. But for us, somehow we have to do the, we have to scan them first, right? Then we know what's new and what's not new, right?
Right. And I saw like you were talking about doing PubMed searches. That's kind of what we do as well. Not as our primary method for finding literature, but that is something that we do on a semi-regular basis.
Got it. And I think is also the other thing we're probably going to learn from you though is kind of as you mentioned that there are top journals where you're going to see more data than the other journals. We're not there yet. I think to us, because the diversity of the journal in our field is in this imprint though is pretty diverse. I would say I just worry about there are epidemiology journals, there are clinical journals, and there's also pharmacology journals. I think there's so many of them. I just worry about what's missing or what's not missing. So our NLP algorithm is not there yet in terms of focusing on journal at all. I think our NLP right now is purely just focused on the keywords and defined by the either drugs or defined by the patient population right now.
Yeah, and you might want to early on in the process now, before you get like any sort of AI NLP stuff worked out, I would highly suggest, you've got a lot of great people that are interested in your resource. You might be able to leverage these people as well and add a system for them to be able to suggest papers like, hey, I know this paper is, this thing has some good information in it. You should think about adding this to your curation. So maybe that's something to think about, making some sort of system available for people to suggest papers for you to curate.
I love it. I love this.
Yeah.
I think we can save a lot of energy to prioritize the journal. We're obviously not there yet. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll add on to Ryan's suggestion, maybe not just suggestions of papers to curate, but we can come up with groups who are big players in the world too, or in maternal and pediatrics. So Utah, North Carolina, and other places where we know have a lot of research, the impact group, and allow them to put in their own information too. So we may not have to comb through all the literature ourselves. So.
That's a good idea too.
Hey Ryan, and I just want the other thing I was trying to ask you guys, how do you guys treat the review papers?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Review papers.
How do we review papers? Oof.
No. How do you, there, to us, sometimes there's shortcuts, right? Getting the majority information is through review papers. And do you guys focus on review papers to get genetic information out of this, or you always go back to the original publications?
I think this is a question better for Rachel since she's the curator. However, she's a little under the weather at this time, and so her voice is out. So you're going to see her chatting a lot in the chat. So she'll be able to. She's furiously typing right now as I'm talking, and she will give you an answer to this question. I'm sorry, I'm more of the technical guy. Okay. I'm not a PhD, so I leave that to her. But yeah, there's I think the answer is we try to go back to the original publications as much as possible. I don't know what what the curation policy for review papers is for us off the top of my head.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. We may want to find another time to get your brain. Put this way. Cool. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Sarah, is our time up?
It is. I think we can go ahead and move on. I am sure that we will be reaching out in the future and maybe making use of Aaron's suggestion for a future symposium focused on data efforts that this can help support. I know we've had a lot of conversation about that over the past day and a half. So we'll go ahead now and move on.